Hi, I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel team proposition and government has basically two burdens to prove in order to win today's debate. It is that we have the responsibility and obligation of every individual to be politically active in the decision-making process of your country, and B is that remaining politically inactive leads to demise of the society and democracy. And whereas team opposition in today's debate, in order to win today's debate, also have two major burdens. Please note, one is that the right of choice. They have to prove that the right of choice matters more than obligation to one's country, and B is that they have to prove how, and they have to basically justify how breaking these societal norms is principally and both socially acceptable. And by doing so, both these teams can win today's debate. Now, the motion we have today is this House believes that apoliticality is immoral, and we proudly propose. Now, three things in my speech. Firstly, framing. Secondly, preemption. And thirdly, argumentation. My second speaker will be also rebutting and further adding on some substantives, whereas the third speaker will be mentioning major clashes and summarizing today's debate. Now, firstly, before we go into the framing, some basic clarification on what basically we wish to define immorality as. We're not calling these individuals immoral, panel. Please note, rather, we're calling the act of not participating or having an active role in political affairs of the country immoral. What morally wrong basically means is like basically not conforming to the acceptable standards of morality according to the society. Now, coming on to the two pieces of framing. Firstly, what does apoliticality look like in the status quo? In the status quo, it basically manifests as a widespread disengagement from political affairs and civic responsibilities. Many individuals, particularly like these younger generation, right, they practically view politics to be boring, irrelevant, or inaccessible, right? And this disinterest in political process leads to lack of participation in elections, activism, and policy discussions, and this further weakens the democracy process and allows special interest to exert disproportionate influence over decision-making process, further reducing the further increasing this systematic injustices and inequalities. And these people basically look like individuals who do not cast any vote in the decision in elections and things like that. Secondly, what do these apolitical people look like in the status quo? These are basically people who often lack awareness or concern for pressing societal issues. We basically tell you they may prioritize personal pursuit or personal goals or like immediate gratification over broader civic responsibilities. These people may avoid political discussions or actively distance themselves from being from political activism, viewing these things such as unnecessary or uninteresting and things like that, right? And this apathy towards politics again contributes to a culture of disengagement and more and this it make more things more complicated. Now, coming on to a few preemptions, which is basically a few things we might expect opposition to say. We just want to clarify beforehand already. Firstly, they might talk about how there's this thing of respect of individual autonomy. We wish to tell you that ignoring one's civic responsibility under the guise of individual autonomy is not only selfish but also negligent, right? Even if these individuals have the right to autonomy, they cannot absolve themselves of social of like duties to society, right? By choosing to be politically inactive, these individuals are essentially neglecting their responsibility to contribute to the common good and allow injustices even to persist unchallenged, right? And even if taking their best case and all of these things do not happen, even if the individual autonomy is like paramount, it does not negate to the societal implications of politicality. We tell you, while individuals have the right to choose their level of political engagement, they should recognize the broader consequences of their action on the society. Secondly, they might talk about pluralism and how like there's this diversity of contributions, right? Again, we wish to clarify beforehand itself that while diversity of contributions is valuable, it should not serve as an excuse to for anyone to be politically for political apathy, right? We tell you, even if individuals engage in other forms of contribution such as volunteer work or philanthropy, we tell you that political engagement remains crucial for addressing systematic injustice and enacting meaningful change on a broader level. Thirdly, in today's debate, if they talk about how if their stance is to be politically how a politicality is morally neutral, we wish to tell you we want to tell you that by asserting politicality to be morally neutral, you're essentially overlooking the societal implications of political disengagement. And politicality is not a personal preference, but it has broader consequences for society, and that is why it is so much needed in the society. Now, coming on to the arguments for today's debate. Firstly, on the principal argument, moral obligation to participate in shaping the society, two layers under it. Firstly, civic responsibility and social contract. Panel, we tell you that in a democratic society, citizens form a social contract where they agree to abide by certain laws and norms in exchange for protection of their rights and participation in the decision-making process, right? We tell you that apathy or like disengagement from these politics violates the social contract and it neglects the responsibility to contribute to the well-being of society. We tell you that they're completely ignoring the responsibility, the obligation to not which they have towards their country and the obligation which they have towards the citizens and like the society as a whole, right? Because like it directly impacts and we're telling you that the impact is going to be so much more, right? Because it essentially weakens the fabric by eroding trust in institutions and diminishing the effectiveness of governments, and it allows a minority to control decisions that affect the majority, which again further increases these inequalities and injustices. Second layer under this is about upholding democratic values and principles. Panel, we tell you that democracy thrives on active citizen participation, including voting, advocacy, and community engagement. We tell you that apathy is or indifference towards politics undermines the core principles of democracy, such as equality, representation, and accountability, right? And you're completely destroying this whole principle, which basically upholds like the foundation of democracy. Does essentially it's not even being upholded on their side of the house. We tell you that when you're prioritizing yourself over this whole societal whole societal political being politically active, we tell you you're not only coming off as selfish, but you're completely ignoring the moral and like your obligation toward your country, right? And this is why we tell you that this moral imperative which is so much necessary to change the injustices and tyranny also taking place, right? The third layer is about the perpetuation of injustices. Panel, we tell you these political systems are dynamic and can either challenge or perpetuate existing inequalities or injustices, right? By choosing to remain apolitical, these individuals are essentially just like supporting the status quo, allowing these oppressive systems or policies to remain unchecked, right? And this lack of opposition contributes to the suffering and marginalization of so many certain groups within the society, again increasing these cycles of injustices and so many more impacts taking place as well on the larger scale in the society, in democracy, weakening all of these things and essentially leading to the demise of democracy. My second speaker will be also expanding a lot more on this, and that is why we want you to side with us in today's debate. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Prime Minister. Now to open the clash, let's welcome Leader of Op here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Let me just pull up a timer. Oops. All right. My pronouns are he, him. I prefer verbal POIs. And my speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. The morality of politics is something that ought not to be considered any kind of moral imperative or responsibility in the sense of damaging to society as a whole. There's a couple of points to this argument, three main substantives. First of all, why apoliticality does exercise the freedom, is a core factor of the exercise of the freedom of autonomy, and why proposition fails to prove that it is not. Secondly, why there exists no moral imperative to engage in political action whatsoever. And third of all, why political engagement from people who are uneducated, who are not accustomed to political engagement, can end up causing more moral harm in the long run, and why this blanket motion is not nuanced or applied to every social situation. First, a couple of points of rebuttal. Listening to proposition's speech, it seems that they try to absolve the entire human right to autonomy possessed by every individual simply because it's outweighed by this nebulous and vague provided concept of social responsibility. Notice how proposition never actually truly explains the mechanism of how political engagement leads to more benefits, right? Why this idea of social responsibility somehow trumps this basic human right, right? There is no characterization of what this thing actually is more than just a buzzword they throw out here. Additionally, they bring up this idea of the social contract, this deal that we made with the state, but doesn't explain why the social contract is a moral matter at all, or why it has to do with the benefit of the whole. Nor is there truly a justification of why there exists a moral imperative to constantly uphold this idea, very theoretical idea, which is very unmechanized, of the social contract. Why does it make the lack of political engagement a bad action whatsoever, right? I don't see any kind of engagement with this. They also mentioned democratic values, which I find to be very problematic. What are democratic values, right? Why does the engagement in political action inherently go against this idea of democracy? So my first point about apoliticality being the exercise of human freedom of choice. So the choice to remain apolitical, not to go forth and vote or attend rallies or engage in political action, again, is simply a facet of human independence and the choices granted to us by basic civil liberties, right? It is an exercise of the inherent right to autonomy in action or inaction provided to every human being. And so it will be immoral to transgress on this right or say it isn't principally valid. There is no moral burden placed on the citizen or the actor here in saying that they are transgressing a moral line by not deciding to participate in a political rally, by not deciding to participate in this kind of political action. No, thank you. I'll take it later. The exercise of this right isn't immoral because it doesn't impede upon the autonomy of others to choose and do the same. It doesn't do direct harm to other people that somebody can foresee. And this is something that I'll expand upon much later. I think Proposition does a very bad job of trying to eliminate this entire thing by assigning this idea of you must love your country, you must uphold social responsibility. What is more important, the right of a person to choose and be autonomous, or this kind of nebulous concept of devotion to your nation and social contract, right? My second main substantive about how there is no moral imperative to engage in political action. First, let's characterize political action. Political movements and political actions in countries can be extremely indirectly connected issues, right? They're not just like, oh, press this button, you will get this benefit. No, thank you. And have consequences or additional caveats unknown to the typical voter or citizen. Due to the intricate and convoluted nature of power systems and political institutions worldwide, it's very likely that dozens of factors unknown to the typical voter's human eye, with countless externalities and hidden demerits, lie outside of what the actual typical citizen is aware of, right? This looks like a cloth to end authoritarianism in China being tied up with a personalistic cult like the Falun Gong. This looks like secret alliances and trade-offs made behind closed doors for candidates who maintain a positive or populist facade. Think about Juan Perón in Argentina. It looks like the aestheticization of politics and painting whitewash over terrible events that justify things like foreign intervention and neocolonialism in countries like Chile and Guatemala during the Nixon administration in the 70s. There is no immediate sense of urgency or immediacy in deciding political action as well. It's not like there's a dying baby in a pond somewhere. There's no clear-cut definitive benefit or cost to a lot of political action. Why? Political issues are oftentimes national, globe spanning, affecting millions of people. There's oftentimes no direct link between voting for a candidate and ending with like children directly getting saved or destroying a genocide, right? Additionally, there are always external factors that need to be considered regarding information when discussing morality. Why? Voting for a candidate seems beneficial and promising can easily turn into a terrible decision as a candidate flip-flops or declares martial law, right? Consider Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. In the first time when he first got elected, he was a populist. He ended up declaring martial law and ruled the Philippines for 21 years. Think about Juan Perón in Argentina, did the same thing. Nobody in the world has perfect information. Placing a moral burden upon people for not participating in politics, expect that person to be a homo economicus, some kind of great man, and be aware of the consequences placed within him. On his head. It's not a realistic expectation. Thus, it is far more logical to argue that political action as a choice is a choice that one can engage in with no moral burden, and one chooses to opt out and buy out of this complex of consequences and distant interests at play with unpredictable and oftentimes terrible consequences. If one wishes to argue that a lack of consideration of the many consequences of being apolitical makes one a detriment of a human being or immoral, then any sort of lack of engagement is immoral, right? Choosing not to work is immoral because you could be bolstering the economy and helping firms grow and funding welfare packages of the government, right? Choosing not to purchase items is moral because you could be supporting the wages of the employees. Not donating at every opportunity is immoral, right? In this world that Proposition is set up for us, there simply does not exist a moral imperative to engage in political action. Before I move on, I'll take a point. No point? Okay. Political engagement from people who are uneducated can end up causing moral harm as well. Why? Forcing political engagement as a moral imperative, placing it as a moral burden, can actually end up causing greater ethical harm to more people. Remember that many people do not have access to adequate education, or that they are constantly influenced by preconceived biases or familial connections with imperfect information into believing disinformation, voting against their own interests or the interests of the whole. Looks like Bolsonaro supporters in Brazil storming the National Congress. Looks like religious fear-mongering in Indonesia, leading to the expulsion of Christian mayors and government officials like Ahok in Jakarta. Since we are cognitive misers, we cannot be expected to critically analyze every piece of information and media we constantly receive in this extremely information-abundant, overdose digital era. Plenty of political opinions will be faulty and may end up playing into the interests of those who are bad actors or end up harming the whole. Right? This motion is blanket. The sheer act of political engagement ought to be considered a moral imperative in the proposition's world. 6-minute mark. I'll take 1 point if there's any points.
Yeah.
No point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Given that societal progress often requires collective action and policy reform, how can apoliticality contribute to meaningful social change beyond individual actions?
Look, one can choose not to engage in political action and not be considered immoral. This is a nuanced action. People can still choose to be politically engaged. However, forcing them essentially to, as a moral burden, to be politically engaged is not something that's extremely moral, because you don't consider all the nuances within political action as a thing. It's not a blanket thing, good or bad. All political action is not good or bad, right? Making morality tied to the blanket act of political engagement ignores the very possible ethical harms that can be done by political engagement, the things that people can use as a way to damage the institutions of democracy, as proposition has lined out so well for us, right? Overall, I think we have successfully proven to you why, first of all, proposition does not trump the burden of why freedom of choice is an important principle of liberty, why there is no moral imperative to actually engage in political action at all due to the unforeseen factors and utilitarianism, and third of all, why political engagement can actually be a bad thing if it is uninformed, and thus it is an unnuanced blanket motion that should not be upheld from side proposition. For these reasons, I think we are proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Leader of UP, now to rebuild the case of Syed Gov. Let's welcome the Deputy Prime Minister here.
Yeah, just give me a few seconds. Am I audible?
Yes, you're both audible and visible.
I'll be starting in 3. Yeah. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, it was funny when the opposition leader talks about how there is like no mechanization on our side of the house, about how apoliticality doesn't really, lead to bad consequences, or about how apoliticality doesn't essentially affect others. Panel, take the picture of the US in the 1800s when Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks in the US challenged segregation laws and challenged systematic racism. We think that not only had a major impact on the way society is today, we think that essentially had macro impact on the way other people in society think about these systematic issues and essentially act upon these systematic issues. We think that moral compass of individuals is like then affected when people take up and people stand up to these like systematic challenges that exist. We think that then proves why politicality essentially leads towards outcomes. I'll explain more about this later. Then 3 things in speech. Firstly, some engagement. Secondly, an extension. And thirdly, some weighing. Then moving on to the engagement in today's debate. 3 points of engagement. Firstly, notice that the speaker talks about how, there is no respect for freedom of choice, and how it's like not very important in this debate. 3 points of responses to this. Firstly, notice how we've already told you in our PM speech about how there is like a more importance being given to like the essential, development of the country and like more civic responsibility to the country, how that is like more important than like the freedom of choice and like freedom of will that these people have. We've told you why that's more important, simply because we've told you that when people are working in a democracy, when people exist in a democracy, they're essentially signing a social contract. They're essentially having a social contract that is like an informal social contract with the government, with the with the country, which essentially gives them protection of their rights. Instead, we think if people's rights are being protected at the end of the day, people have this moral incentive, people have this moral obligation, like essentially a responsibility that they like need to act upon moral issues. They need to act upon the issues that are happening around them. This has already been well explained in PM speech. Even if that is not true, notice how it does affect others. Like I've already told you, it essentially like perpetuates the system of injustices that are already existing in society. The reason why like apoliticality is like not good in the first place is because when you are being apolitical, you're essentially conceding to the system that already exists. You're essentially saying, oh look, racism exists, oh look, sexism exists, but these things are fine. We don't really need to, act upon it, our opinion here, or like our actions here don't matter because we are okay with how things are. Now, this may seem okay to you on a micro level, but if you think on a macro level, when you're considering more important things about like the development of society in general, the development of the country in like a social manner, we think these things then have like a greater principal value than what opposition tells you in today's debate. See, even if you don't buy all of that, notice how this should like not come at the, like that freedom of choice should not come at the expense of like social progress. And like I already told you, the magnitude of impact then on their side of the house is like much worse because they're only able to get like, a micro level impact for you on their side by kind of respecting this autonomy of people. We think on our side of the house, even if that autonomy is like not there, we think the macro impact we're able to generate is much more. Secondly, notice that they talk about how there's like no moral imperative. Two responses to this. Firstly, notice of again, like already told you in our PM speech about how there is moral imperative simply because it not only affects people that are like these people who are essentially being apolitical. Like I've already told you, it does also affect others. We think this transforms in ways like the narratives or trends that you set in society. If you're being apolitical, this kind of like sets this image that okay, look, apolitical is okay. If we're taking this like on a micro level on their side of the house, we think the impacts then like exacerbated in terms of things like okay, being apolitical is okay, not being civic, not engaging in like political discourse, not giving importance to things that are like essentially straining the way we develop in society today is bad. Then B, even if you don't buy all of that, like we've already told you, because of the sole existence of that social contract, because of the sole moral responsibility you have towards your country, being political is important. You can't essentially be neutral on these things. Lastly, let's talk about how there's like people who simply don't have enough knowledge and act upon these things in a bad manner. Three responses to this. A, firstly, notice how these people who are being apolitical essentially don't vote. They have no interest in these in politics. So we don't think these are like the knowledgeable people who will be voting, because the reason then is because these people simply don't have an incentive. Notice how if I was a political person, I don't have an incentive to stand in a line of like polls for like 6 hours just to vote. I think that doesn't happen. Very illogical and contingent on assumption by opposition. Then B, even if that is not true, notice how this still like further just marginalizes communities, because this is not the solution. Being apolitical is not the solution. I think the solution then looks like essentially trying to educate people and give people the knowledge to make an informed decision. All the points by opposition to today's debate make no sense, everything broken down. Then even if you don't buy all of that and what PM has told you in today's debate, he'll prove to you how they still do not prove how like apoliticality is justified and can be morally correct. And even if like that is not important, I'll give you like another extension that you should another extension in today's debate about how you essentially set harmful trends and narratives of apoliticality. Three layers under this. Firstly, notice how there's this influence of trendy apathy. Panel, notice how in the modern world, apoliticality has become like a trend, especially among like the younger generations, like Gen Z, where like disinterest or like detachment from political affairs like seems to be glorified to such an extent, where it's like a symbol of like non-conformity or like rebellion. People think it's cool to like not be engaged in political affairs. People think it's cool to not know about what's happening in our country, what's happening to the people of our country. We think this then has a great impact on the way society works, simply because it fosters a culture of apathy towards like civic engagement, towards like undermining the importance of active participation. We think in the long run, the impact then looks like people being like more detached from doing good, people being more detached from working towards like the betterment of society. Then secondly, notice how the like negative narratives and like misguided priorities of people being like glorified here. And the analysis behind this is that glorifying politicality sets like wrong narratives in society by suggesting that political engagement is like unnecessary or like uncool. This undermines the importance of being informed and actively participating in democratic processes. Now, even if you like buy what opposition tells you and like believe that okay, it's not important, like everyone has that freedom of choice to like not participate in these political processes, we still think it's like important for people to be informed, because people not only influence other people by like being political. We think like the interaction, the way the social fabric is, the way that people interact with each other in society, we think you need to have opinions formed, because you not only impact society by participating in these elections, you also impact society by engaging with other individuals, interacting with other individuals, and influencing other individuals by the opinions that you have. You being neutral does not really help. The normalization of politicality like fosters the culture of like complacency and like indifference towards like pressing social issues that exist in the world today. And this has like a lot of harmful consequences. Now, even if you don't buy all of this, let's weigh this debate in terms of magnitude. When you see that politicality is like being normalized on that side of the house, we think like there's simply a loss of like the democratic sense of civic or like democratic process, like democratic participation. All these things are like on a loss on that side of the house, whereas all these things are like leading to an increased participation in democratic processes, like strengthening of these democratic institutions are not set as panel. If you believe in a world where democracy is only going to be strengthened and people like essentially work towards solving the pressing issues that we face in the world today, vote government.
Thank you for that, Deputy Prime Minister. Now, to rebuild for the case of side opposition, let's welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition here.
My pronouns are she, her, and I prefer verbal POI, so please don't put them in chat. I start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'd like to start my speech with a little thought experiment. Imagine a debater named Kayla standing in front of 2 doors. Behind one of them is a lion, and the other has $1 million. If, because of limitations in my circumstances, I mistake the lion door for the money one, I don't think I'm actually meaningfully making a real choice. In my speech, I'll first do some quick rebuttals, and secondly, talk about the high costs of informed politicality. First, rebuttals. Proposition's biggest push is this consequentialist argument about how you're going to get meaningful political change if everybody engages in political action. But what they fail to recognize is that very little political change can be made by one person. There are 2 reasons for this. Firstly, one vote is not going to make an impact even in the swingiest of swing states. Secondly, democracy is quite weak because there's corruption, there's lobbying, campaign financing, corporate capture, gerrymandering. So that means that the one person can't do that all that much. Like all of their impacts of like political change are very, very small. Secondly, consequentialism can't be taking something from someone to give to another. Some people can't afford to go on a strike in solidarity with people with limited labor rights. Even if them showing up is the magical tipping point, it's still not fair to them to go on strike and potentially lose their job.
POI, ma'am.
No, thank you. Their argument to its logical conclusion, if not doing anything while people on the other side of the world is suffering is so evil, they're basically saying that people have the obligation to dedicate every single hour of their entire lives to campaigning and donate every single cent to NGOs. So also, finally, I just want to note that they have no weighing against civic responsibility versus the right to choose. I don't think civic responsibility is just going to magically trump everything. I'll take your point.
Does the speaker realize being political doesn't mean you have to go on strikes? You just need to have a sense of opinion or like knowledge about politics and be engaged with the political system?
That's extremely squirrely, because if apoliticality means that you don't have a single political thought in your brain, then literally nobody is apolitical. And also, just being meaningfully informed about political issues is very difficult, which is my first point. So I want to note that the benefits of politicality are limited to true informed politicality. If someone is ill-informed, then they might end up like accidentally supporting oppression or buying into harmful propaganda. For example, some people might oppose abortion on moral grounds, but they might not know that the same procedure is used for miscarriage and other medical concerns. So abortion doesn't just harm women who want it, it also harms a lot of other people of all genders who may have different medical complications. If you're just informed and taking no political action, then that's just useless also. But true informed politicality takes a lot of time and effort. You have to do things like read the news, research the views of different political candidates, and look at the details of different policies to see their nuances. You have to engage in discussions with people from different perspectives to check if your views are actually accurate and reflective of what they actually think. You also have to do some level of political action, from reposting a post on Instagram to attending protests or going out to vote. This is inherently difficult for the most vulnerable groups of people. There are many structural reasons why this is true. I list 3, but there are more. First, some people are just less educated. This was mentioned by the PM. For instance, people from poorer areas typically don't go to college, they just stop at high school. This means that they might not know that much about the historical political injustices that still have an impact today, or the nuances of pros and cons of policies, or they might even have limited critical thinking because of their limited education. So if these people are ill-informed, they might easily be swayed by rhetoric and populism into supporting things that are against their own interests. We think that is way worse than just not taking political stances at all. Secondly, some people live in the rural areas. There might be news deserts, or the possible controlling of the media narrative by political elites, or there might be the prevalence of one political opinion such that they're not able. their biases. No, thank you. So compared to people in urban areas who are passively exposed to multilateral political perspectives and discourse in daily life, these people have to make a far greater active effort and even take money to subscribe to newsletters or figure out what the political hot topics are at the time just because they're not exposed to that passively. Thirdly, some people are poor. They just don't have time because they have to work a lot of hours or they can't afford a nanny, so they have to stay at home and take care of the kids. Fourthly, some people are just young. They have limited critical thinking. They might not know where to get good political info. So we think not being political as a young person is better than blindly listening to Fox News and believing everything.
ma'am.
Note that the prop's only response is we should educate people. But firstly, they don't have fiat to do that. But even if they do, even if they manage to do like an entire education campaign, they're still unlikely to magically cover 100 of people. 100% of people under this education campaign, so this unfairness still exists. There are two reasons why this is problematic. Firstly, people have other moral obligations. There are two different types of obligations, right? Firstly, obligations you owe to everyone versus special obligations you owe to people you have a responsibility to. This looks like your family. This looks like people you are in a reciprocal responsibility relationship with, like your employer. Why is this debate winning? Because civic responsibility still has no thank you against other moral principles. People cannot consent to being a member of the state because they didn't opt in. And just to preempt, prop cannot say like using things like roads or like living in a society is means like means you're opting in because they didn't choose. Like you literally can't do anything without using a road, so that's not a meaningful choice. Just because I mow your lawn for you doesn't mean I can take $40 from your pocket. So but however, there are things that do create a contract, like having unprotected sex, then you not have a responsibility to a child, which a poor single mom on the Rust Belt taking care of multiple kids cannot afford to go out on the cannot afford to go out to protest the mistreatment of people on the other side of the world because she has a far greater responsibility to take care of the kids. And on intensity of impact, like this protest is probably not going to have a lot of impact, but your kids literally rely on you to live. So we're not saying apoliticality is morally good, but just that it's not immoral, it's not evil to prioritize other stronger moral obligations. Secondly, there's an unfair moral burden because nobody chose to be poor and uneducated. It's principally unjust to view them as immoral just because they physically cannot juggle so many things at once. This is important because these are the most vulnerable stakeholders. They already have a lot on their plate. It's important to weigh the high cost of informed politicality versus the low impact they're realistically going to make. For those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you for that, DLO. Now to crystallize the case for side government, let's welcome Government Whip. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, a counterfactual and burden is not to force politicality on everyone. It's to prove the ethical rightness of it. All the mechanization they do is contingent on the impacts of the inability of politicality for marginalized communities and not on the very principal nature of it. And that's where opposition gets this debate wrong. We assert that apoliticality carries moral weight, undermining democratic principles and perpetuating systemic injustices. It's not merely a matter of personal choice, but a retreat from a collective responsibility to shape society. By disengaging from political processes, individuals weaken the legitimacy of democratic institutions. And I don't think it's easy to say as opposition that democracy doesn't change anything. It doesn't really have an impact. I see that as an escapist mechanism on their side of the house, because I see that they needed to give structural mechanisms on how apoliticality is moral, how it's a good thing for society, and how it's going to have beneficial consequences at the end of the day. Panel note that they never really engage with in their first two speakers about how the narratives are changed. the negative consequences of this, of how apoliticality does not only impact democracy, but also society as a whole. We needed engagement from their side of the house. 3 things in my speech. Firstly, engagement with whatever opposition has told to you. Secondly, clashes with different layers of analysis. And thirdly, weighing on 3 different metrics: magnitude, vulnerability, and time frame. I think the pushes that the LO just tries to push along and gives you is that, firstly, respect for individual autonomy. 2 responses to this: ignoring one's civic responsibilities under the guise of individual autonomy is not only selfish, but also negligent. Secondly, you have to recognize the broader consequences of this taking place. Secondly, they talk about politics does not have any plausible benefits. And this is where I think they get quite detached from their case, because the entire case is contingent on the fact that it's for marginalized communities. They won't be able to do much, they won't be able to understand. But the thing is, they need to fight for the principle of apoliticality. They need to prove to us how it's moral, how it's fine. I think they're unable to do that completely. Let me give you 3 responses to what they given under this argument. Firstly, there's not, even though if there's not like immediate benefits, I talk about broader movement of social movements. Also, secondly, political changes can inspire others. We also see that there'll be long-term impact. Unless they're able to like engage with that fact of these broader consequences, we need to talk about the impact that politics and democracy as a whole has on society. I think at some moments of the case, they disengage from this fact and go on this entire rant about how democracy is useless, it's not going to make any difference. My third response is the recognition of structural barriers without politics, about how you're further marginalizing groups because you're not engaging with politics as a whole. Then they also talk about how people are uninformed. 3 responses to this: I think people being uninformed does not directly correspond to apoliticality as a whole. What does apoliticality do, and how does it say? How do you frame it? I think it basically looks like people not having a thought, people being disinterested. It's not people being uninformed. That's not how it works. 3 responses to this is basically that apoliticality keeps the scenario the same. Telling that it's fine to not be informed, telling that it's fine to not have an interest in politics keeps the scenario the same. How does this benefit marginalized groups, vulnerable communities? I think these are questions that they really need to answer, because we're fighting for the principle of how apoliticality is immoral, about how it disengages from many things that are really important to society as a whole. I think they underestimate the power of grassroots movements, does not really allow for inclusivity in democracy. And I think this is what is really important. I think DLO comes apart and tells to you one person can't do much. I think 2 responses to this, I think we can clearly see the mindset of opposition as a whole. As they could never really engage with the principle, I think they needed to take this escapist mechanism of it's not going to work for marginalized groups. It's not really it's not really important for them. I think my second response to this is that democracy, at the end of the day, unintentionally, even if you tell that it doesn't have an impact, it does have an impact on policies, on lives of people living in that country. And due to the entire social contract, when you have rights, freedom of expression, I think you also have a right to the country as a whole to be informed, to be make decisions, because you need to know and be able to form decisions. Nextly, they talk to you about like apoliticality and against politicality. I think where they go wrong with this is that they try to say that politicality is basically people going on protest every single day, being completely engaged, being completely sure, doing a lot of things, heading parties, because that is the framework that they try to push on to you. I think they just need to be engaged. They just need to have a thought. And that is how we have framed this debate. And we feel that it's completely fair. Then they tell to you that there's no fear to assume that education will happen. I think they had no way to like really engage with this, because we told you as long as there's a chance of it happening on our side, where apoliticality is said to be immoral, said to not be a good thing, said to be apart from social standards set by society, we see that there's a chance of it happening where it doesn't happen on their side at all. What does this lead to? Negative benefits for negative effects for society. And they talk about unfair moral burden. We've already engaged with that fact about how right to individual autonomy does not come over like societal effects. Now, moving on through my clashes. My first clash is my principal clash. Is apoliticality immoral? Actually, yes. Because firstly, you have like responsibility to society. Secondly, you have the impact on democratic processes. Thirdly, Ethical imperatives. How does this work? In situations where political action is necessary to challenge injustices or uphold human rights. We see that remaining apolitical can be seen as complicity with wrongdoing. Finally, we talk about like civic responsibility and addressing systemic injustices. I think on their side of the house, you basically see that it's fine to not care about democracy. It's fine to not try to make change in society. It's fine to not care about what's happening in our country. That is the narrative that they then force on, and this leads to much worse negative benefits. Because now I'll move on to my practical clash, which are what are the underlying effects of apoliticality as a whole. I think there's diminished representation. I think you have people being like, okay, the influence of trendy apathy. Okay, we don't care. It's fine not to care. Weaken accountability. You no longer can make democracy accountable as a whole because you're undermining democracy as a whole. These are issues because then you have like perpetuation of injustice, you have more corruption on their side of the house. I think for all of these reasons, with democracy able to make a change in society, policies are worse off on their side of the house because they're never really able to engage with the principle of how apoliticality is kind of fine. Give the win to side government. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Call Whip. Now to crystallize the case for side opposition, let's welcome opposition Whip. You're here.
Hi, I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, sure. Let me set up my timer. Her, she pronounced, and I prefer POI verbally. So I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Not choosing to vote on Trump or Biden does not make me immoral, and it should not be judged by the society. Social changes should be made. Proud to oppose. To begin with, I'll first respond to the Deputy Prime Minister on how he claimed that not actively engaging in political activities demotivates me, right? So to be honest, I'm not really interested in Macau politics, right? And to be honest, I have not voted since I've turned 18. But still, I study, I work, and I love my motherland. Therefore, I don't see how not engaging in politics diminish my motivations to work, right? I'm still actively motivated, like for example, from my teachers and parents' trust, etc. In my speech today, I'll first go through all the proposition's arguments, but actually mainly from what I can conclude is that they claim that moral obligations are important, social contract, and etc. Then I'll further extend on the case of our side of the house, lastly wrapping up with some weighing. To begin with, on the proposition sides, on their moral obligations, right? They first talk about social contract. However, these have already also been mentioned by my leader of oppositions that they have failed to prove social contract is also moral. Therefore, I don't see how this argument stands. Secondly, they also mainly talk about democracy. Later, I believe that also a key aspect of democracy is also individuals' freedom and rights for their actions. Why apoliticality exists, right? Because there is the existence of people with less interest and background in politics and do not want to engage in these political activities. Therefore, forcing people in could lead to 1, uninformed decision making, therefore leading to harmful outcome. Like for example, they will vote for the politicians who gave them goods and benefits during the elections periods without getting actually know on their background, right? We also believe that democracy is also not about everyone participating in politics. Again, we believe that we should focus on quality over quantity. Instead of judging people who do not want to get involved in political activities, we should focus on people who choose to actively engage in rights. Therefore, I don't see how all their arguments are so impactful, and I don't see how they happen. Before I proceed to the extensions on our side of the house, yes.
How do you propose holding leaders and institutions accountable for their actions in the absence of widespread political engagement, especially considering the importance of democratic principles in the country?
I'll respond to this later on in my speech. So to continue with is the extensions on our side of the house. We have 2 main arguments that I believe we can win this debate. Firstly, about freedom of choice, and secondly, about the burdens on the people if we force them to engage in politics rights. Firstly, on freedom of choice. We believe that engaging in politics is not the only duty of the citizens. What are the other duties of a citizen? It's like, for example, paying tax, following the law, stand for the country's reputations, etc. What we are trying to tell here is that as long as the act of a citizens do not bring any harm to their country, they cannot be considered as immoral. On the contrary, not engaging in politics might bring more good than harm to the government. Like the only harm, like, no, thank you. Like the only harm we can see here is that we will get less voting, right? However, the good is that it can actually prevent aggressiveness from the people, from the citizens. How? Here we can see in two situations, right? One, if the country have a good political background, if they fail in the future, people who were actively engaged in politics, they will know the reason why the country failed, right? Therefore, eventually they will lose trust in the country. Therefore, harming the country. On the second situations, on the if the country have a horrible political background, right? This is very simple. It consistently make the people down, therefore losing trust on the government. The outcome is that one, they might go on protest, which is harmful to the country. Two, they will, if the country continues to corrupt, the citizens will leave the country. And also three, they will not anymore willing to be proud to be one of the citizens, which this is very harmful because it is harming the international reputations and status of the country, right?
POI?
If the government considers apoliticality to be immoral, eventually the citizens will be frustrated because it's like, I'm their citizens and I'm willing to work for you. But in the end, you just ignore my contributions and you think that I don't engage in politics, I'm immoral. Therefore, we believe that forcing people into politics is immoral and is already harming the country and the people. The second main argument from our side of the house is about the burdens. If I would like to ask them more on this, I would like to talk about some impacts of these burdens, right? We believe that on the very ground level is of the mental burden. Imagine you were forced to vote, but in the end, the one leader you voted did not turn out to be as good as expected. Isn't it sad to take this responsibility on yourself, right? We believe this is not the responsibility of the citizens my term came off. This is not the responsibility of the citizens, and it's not a responsibility a citizens should take. Therefore, we believe that the government should not oppress this responsibility on us. Lastly, on some weighing, to wrap up my speech, I believe the main clash of this debate is that people's right versus social impressions rights. We, our side of the house, the oppositions, stands for the people's rights. The proposition side simply oppress the people, forcing them to engage in political activities and to vote. And I don't see how this is a very good social impressions, which the proposition side is trying to stand for. However, on the contrary, on our side of the house, the oppositions, we try our best to protect the people's right, whether it's people who would like to actively engage in politics, people who are not interested in politics, or people from any disadvantaged backgrounds, etc. We have also proven on our side of the house that the governments will not be greatly harmed and still will be benefited from it, even apoliticality is considered to be moral. Our side of the house win on the scale and vulnerability, therefore proud to oppose.
Thank you for that opposition whip. Now to move on to the reply speeches, let's first welcome opposition reply. Here.
Am I audible? Hello?
Yes, you're audible.
Excellent. My speech will begin in 3, 2, 1. Throughout this debate, a far greater burden has existed on side proposition in making this a matter of morality. They have to prove that somehow it is immoral to abstain. That is their burden, to essentially do nothing. They made this not just a matter of consequences, but one of morality, that you are somehow infringing on a moral imperative if you do not engage in political action actively. Why do I believe that side opposition has decisively taken the cake and won this round on major two clashes? These are the reasons. Two major clashes have been identified throughout the debate. First of all, the principal right to autonomy. They try to trump and outweigh this. Second of all, the idea of the moral imperative, why it is necessary for you to engage in political action. Firstly, on the right to autonomy clash. Side opposition has consistently maintained the line of the right to autonomy, right? We've clearly delineated why the right to autonomy is important and not to be upheld. We've mechanized the principle of not transgressing autonomy so long as no visible harm is done to other people's autonomy, a consistent philosophical line. And while proposition continuously attempts to push that this idea of social responsibility, this idea of devotion to one country, somehow trumps this, conceding that on their side, they don't have the right to autonomy. They fail to truly effectively weigh how this fundamental human right, key to the foundation of states and individual freedoms, is apparently less important than the imperative of having an opinion or tossing a ballot. They ignore our analysis on how politics is a convoluted network that oftentimes do not have clear ends, don't have clear solutions to things, how there is no baby in the pond, and how casting your vote doesn't necessarily mean a direct benefit for net society, right? Additionally, that's why I believe that the right to autonomy clash still trumps over their explanations. And the second clash on the moral imperative. Our case is predicated on this argument that you cannot expect people, rational people, even educated people, to be able to see political consequences and the negative externalities of political action. If that is true, it is even less true, it is even more true that less educated people, people who are more likely to be influenced by media, by pundits, are able to do the same. Thus, we should not consider abstention to be immoral. In our world, people still have a choice to engage in politics. This is the case we've consistently built, but it will be unfair to blame or place a moral burden on a person for not being politically engaged, right? Again, there exists no imperative here, moral imperative here, ethical imperative here. This is taken further when you consider our analysis of utilitarianism. Making this a matter of morality means that they would have to consider how this influences the whole, this laid out in DLO. When politics is so convoluted and consideration of our characterizations of people being cognitive misers who are not fully rational, the potential risks fielded by folks is so much greater. Our case doesn't insist upon the complete extension from political activity for everyone, or that it is immoral to engage in political activity. Just that it's not a matter of morality or moral imperative to engage in political action. It is not immoral to abstain. That is always the case we've been trying to make, regardless of any consequences that they can bring. Additionally, they fail to engage on a couple of points that we've consistently made. I believe they fail to engage the case on it causing moral harm on people, who the greater moral harm it can do to society due to people being misled by pundits if they make this a moral burden. They've additionally failed to truly engage on points like on how their responsibility to the nation trumps closer responsibilities to people they care greater about, to your family, to your job, to your close loved ones, right? All these points remain unengaged by side proposition, and I believe thus we've taken the cake on those short clashes as well. Overall, what have we decisively proven to you? We've proven to you that the right to autonomy is a burden that exists purely on everybody on the world, and that side proposition has failed to truly identify, first of all, the fact why any of their consequences trump this basic right. Secondly, conceding the fact that they do not have this right on the other side of the house. Secondly, on the clash of the moral imperative, we've decisively demonstrated to you that politics is not a matter of direct win-lose games. That additionally, when considering the greater responsibility placed on us by other responsibilities, and additionally the fact that we are all short-sighted and can oftentimes fail to effectively engage in political action, why the choice to not engage in political action is not inherently in and of itself a bad one or a necessity to do in order to be a moral person or to do a moral action. For these reasons, I believe we've decisively taken the cake on both main clashes in this debate, and we are prouder and could not be prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you for that opposition reply. Now to end this debate, let's welcome government reply. Here.
Yeah, just give me a minute. Yeah. I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, it's funny how opposition loses this debate because they fail to understand the primary purpose of this debate. This debate is not about mechanizing principles, or like not only about who's able to get better impacts at the end of the day. It's also about determining the ethical nature of apoliticality. I think that's a strategic mistake opposition made. That's where they fail. Okay, then 3 clashes in the speech. Firstly, on context. Secondly, on how on whether apoliticality is moral or immoral, and thirdly, on whether the house is able to create like better consequences for society. Panel. Then coming on to the first clash in today's debate, 2 questions that we're going to answer here. what does apoliticality look like, and like what's the counterfactual on the other side. Panel, notice how this entire debate has been like so messy simply in terms of context, because opposition fails to understand what apoliticality looks like and what's the counterfactual of politicality. Like what does that opposite of that look like on our side of the house. Notice how they keep pushing this idea that apoliticality is not like just abstaining from voting. Panel, notice how we've already told you apoliticality is just not only about voting, or it's just not about that. We think it's in general about the political engagement you have with the system. I think the kind of engagement or interaction you can have with the political system, with political institutions, with people in the democracy, people around you, we think that then is also something that comes under apoliticality, your interaction with other people. It's not only about voting. Even then, notice how the counterfactual they try to push on our side of the house is that, oh look, politicality means you have to go on strikes, you have to go on protests, especially in the case of marginalized people. They simply can't afford to do so. Blah blah blah. Panel, I don't think any of that matters when opposition whips tells us, oh look, that's not important for me because I'm like already motivated to like work towards society and I don't really need to be political about it. I'm not interested in politics. Panel, just notice how that is again maybe good for them, but like simply that's a minority case, simply because notice how politics is essentially like the basis for development in society. So if we're talking about the majority of the cases, people who are simply having an aversion to politics, which is basically the textbook definition of apoliticality, if you have an aversion to politics, if you have an aversion to the system which is based on the development of society, I think in a majority of cases, people are simply like abstaining, or not only from voting, people are also abstaining from working for society. And secondly, what is the situation of these uninformed voters, or what is the situation of like these marginalized communities look like? Notice how we don't force people to go on strikes or protest. It's about having a political opinion. They tell about how, oh look, everyone has a political opinion. It's more than like having a political opinion. We've told you it's what expression of that political opinion. We think expression of your political opinion can not only happen by voting for someone, it happens in other ways. They also talk about how media essentially manipulates these marginalized communities. Man, look, that is not the point of this debate. We, at least on our side of the house, trying to like educate these people. We're trying to like mechanize some better impacts for these people in the future, simply because we're able to like get better democratic institutions. We're able to get a better democracy for these people. And even if all of that doesn't matter, we think these uninformed voters or these marginalized communities are the people who are affected the most. We think eventually people will eventually like gain that awareness. We think as we're like a forward progressing society, this awareness will only increase. Whereas if they promote apoliticality, we think this awareness will actually decrease. Secondly, is apoliticality immoral or immoral? But even if being moral is not what is not that burden on the side of the house, notice how the only principle they give in today's debate is about the right to autonomy. We talk about the social contract. We think our principle essentially just overrides that principle simply because we're able to generate a macro impact on our side of the house, because we are protecting the rights of people in exchange for people being intact with the political system. People are getting these rights simply because they are politically engaging. They also don't answer our POI. Notice how they told that they'll answer our POI later by web, but they don't really answer it about how, who are you going to hold accountable when democratic institutions fail, simply because people are not engaging with democracy. Big fall on opposition in terms of principle. And lastly, in terms of which side of the house creates better consequences for society, they've basically engaged on nothing. We talked about narratives, we've talked about bad trend, we've talked about weakening of democratic institutions, about how all of this leads to like a worse society in general. We've also given you the example of how this can actually happen, because we've given the example of Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks about how they essentially kind of battled and challenged systematic issues. We think that is essentially the mechanization on our side. They didn't really respond to any of that. Proposition takes us to debate.
All right, thank you for that government reply. Thank you, debaters, for this round. You may now virtually cross the house.